reached the bell. Elizabeth's maid, Phoebe, came toward to take her mistress's cloak, and the floor valet was there to relieve Philip of his overcoat. A waiter was hovering in the background. "Supper is served in the dining room, sir," he announced. "Shall I open the wine?" Philip nodded and showed Elizabeth over the little flat, finally ushering her into the small round dining room. "It's perfectly delightful," she declared. "But we don't need nearly so much room, Philip. What a dear little dining table, and what a delicious supper! Everything I like best in the world, from pâté de foie gras to cold asparagus. You are a dear." The waiter disappeared with a little bow. They were alone at last. She held his hands tightly. She was trembling. The forced composure of the last few minutes seemed to have left her. "I am silly," she faltered. "But the servants and everything, they won't come back, will they?" He laughed as he patted her hand. "We shan't see another soul, dear," he assured her. She laid her cheek against his. "How hot your face feels!" she exclaimed. "Throw open the window, do. I shan't feel it." He obeyed her at once. The roar of the city, all its harshness muffled, came to them in a somber, almost melodious undernote. She rested her hands upon his shoulder. "What children we are!" she murmured. "Now it's you who are trembling. Sit down, please. You've been so brave these last few days." "It was just for a moment," he told her. "It seems too wonderful. I had a sudden impulse of terror lest it should all be snatched away." She laughed easily. "I don't think there's any fear of that, dear," she said. "Perhaps—" There was a little knock at the door. Philip, who had been holding Elizabeth's chair, stood as though transfixed. Elizabeth gripped at the side of the table. It was some few seconds before either of them spoke. "It is perhaps Beatrice," Elizabeth faltered. The knock was repeated. Philip drew a little breath. "Come in," he invited. The door opened slowly towards them and closed again. It was Mr. Dane who had entered. From outside they caught a momentary glimpse of another man, waiting. Mr. Dane took off his hat. For a man with so expressionless a countenance, he was looking considerably perturbed. "Miss Dalstan," he said, "I am very sorry, believe me, to intrude. I only heard of your marriage an hour ago. I wish I could have prevented it." "Prevented it?" Elizabeth repeated. "What do you mean?" "I think that Mr. Philip Romilly could explain," Dane continued, turning towards Philip. "I am sorry, but I have received an imperative cable from Scotland Yard, and it is my duty to arrest you, Philip Romilly, and to hold you pending the arrival of a special police mission from England. I am bound to take note of anything you may say, so I beg of you not to ask me any particulars as to the charge." The color slowly faded from Elizabeth's cheeks. She had risen to her feet and was gripping the mantelpiece for support. Philip, however, was perfectly calm. He poured out a glass of water and held it to her lips. "Drink this, dear," he begged, "and don't be alarmed. It sounds very terrible, but believe me there is nothing to be feared." He swung suddenly round to Dane. His voice shook with passion. "You've kept me under observation," he cried, "all this time. I haven't attempted to escape. I haven't moved from New York. I haven't the slightest intention of doing so until this thing is cleared up. Can't you take my parole? Can't you leave me alone until they come from England?" Mr. Dane shook his head slowly. He was a hard man, but there was an unaccustomed look of distress in his face. "Sorry, Mr. Romilly," he said regretfully. "I did suggest something of the sort, but they wouldn't hear of it at headquarters. If we let you slip through our fingers we should never hear the last of it from London." Then there came another and a still more unexpected interruption. From outside they heard Beatrice's voice raised in excitement. Mr. Dane stood on one side as the door was thrown open. Beatrice suddenly flung herself into the room, dragging after her a man who was almost breathless. "I say, Beatrice, steady!" the latter began good-naturedly. There followed the most wonderful silence in the world, a silence which was filled with throbbing, indescribable emotions, a silence which meant something different for every one of them. Beatrice, gripping her captive by the wrist, was looking around, striving to understand. Elizabeth was filled with blank wonder. Mr. Dane was puzzled. But Philip, who a moment before had seemed perfectly composed, was the one who seemed torn by indescribable, by horrible emotions. He was livid almost to the lips. His hands were stretched out as though to keep from him some awful and ghastly vision. His eyes, filled with the anguished light of supreme terror, were fastened upon the newcomer. His lips shook as he tried to speak. "Take him away!" he shrieked. "Oh, my God!" Beatrice, more coherent than any of them, scoffed at him. "Don't be a fool," she cried. "Take him away, indeed! He's the most wonderful thing that ever happened. He's the one man in life you want to see. So you've come for him, eh?" she went on, turning almost like a wildcat on Dane. "You beast! You chose to-night, did you? Now get on with it, then, and I'll give you the surprise of your life. What are you here for?" "I am here to arrest that man, Philip Romilly, for the murder of his cousin, Douglas Romilly, Miss Wenderley," Dane announced gravely. "I am sorry." Beatrice threw her head back and laughed hysterically. "You'll never write a play like it, Philip," she exclaimed. "There never was anything like it before. Now, Mr. Dane, what is it you say in America when you want to introduce anybody? 'Shake hands with Mr. Douglas Romilly.' That's it. Shake hands with the dead man here, and then get on with your arresting. He must be dead if you say so, but he doesn't look it, does he?" Philip's face had become a more natural color. His eyes had never left the other man's. He swayed a little on his feet, and his voice seemed to him to come from a long way off. "Douglas? It isn't you, Douglas? It isn't you, really?" "I wish you'd all leave off staring at me as though I were a ghost," the other man answered, almost pettishly. "I'm Douglas Romilly, right enough. You needn't look in such a blue funk, Philip," he went on, his fingers mechanically rearranging his collar and tie, which Beatrice had disarranged. "I served you a beastly trick, and you went for me. I should have done the same if I'd been in your place. On the other hand, I rather turned the tables on you by keeping quiet. Perhaps it's up to me to explain." Elizabeth, feeling her way by the mantelpiece, came to Philip's side. His arm supported her, holding her as though in a vice. "Is that your cousin?" she whispered hoarsely. "Is that Douglas Romilly? Is he alive after all?" Philip had no words, but his face spoke for him. Then they both turned to listen. The newcomer had dragged a chair towards him, and was leaning over the back of it. He addressed Philip. "We met, as you know, on the canal path that beastly afternoon," he began. "I was jolly well ashamed of myself for having made love to Beatrice, and all the rest of it, and you were mad with rage. We had a sort of tussle, and you threw me into the canal. It was a nasty dark spot just underneath the bridge. I expect I was stunned for a moment, but it was only for a moment. I came to long before I choked, and when I remembered your grip upon my throat, I decided I was safer where I was. I could swim like a duck, you know, and though it was filthy water, I took a long dive. When I came up again, gad, what disgusting water it was! You were tearing off like a creature possessed. That's the true history of our little fracas." "But afterwards?" Philip